Well, it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum, left or right. Everybody seems to be in agreement that there is something wrong with what's going on in the American system right now. And the crazy part is that this guy from Greece kind of predicted a lot of it over 2,000 years ago. And he didn't just predict it for the United States. He essentially predicted it for government itself. He predicted it for the cycles that different civilizations go through. And here's the scary part. His prediction, his analysis, which is referred to as anacyclosis, is essentially undefeated in over 2,000 years of history since he came up with this concept. Now, there was one country that I looked at that he thought might have actually broken the cycle, and that nation was Rome. But here's the deal. We all know they didn't break the cycle. So the questions that we're going to be asking today, which are especially important for the United States, especially important for those of us who love our country and would like to preserve the best elements of the American system, these questions have to be asked and we have to answer them. And we have to answer them honestly. Because if we don't properly diagnose the problem, no amount of cure is going to actually help. And we can't bury our heads in the sand and pretend that we're just something special in America and we're somehow immune from these sorts of concerns, because we're starting to see them take place within our generation, which means it's our generation's responsibility to figure something out. So here are the three questions. As we look at Polybius and anacyclosis and everything that he analyzed, we're going to ask, why does this cycle seem to devour all political orders, no matter how carefully crafted? The second question we're asking is, what did Polybius get wrong and right about Rome? Because it did last a long time. And then three, we're going to ask, is there any chance that we here in the United States can finally break this cycle or perhaps work within it in order to prevent the worst from taking place and once again preserve the best elements of American society, both socially, economically, and politically? All of that coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I am your host, Nick Freitas. And to give you a little bit of reference here, my background is both as a soldier and as an elected representative. So that's the experience I'm going to be bringing to the table. I have my beautiful bride in the studio with me, Tina, who's also been a candidate for political office. We also have our resident historian and political prognosticator, Christian Hines. You want to talk about a guy that's been really, really good at predicting election cycles? The Oracle of Virginia is your guy. Now, before we jump into all of this, when we talk about saving America, one of the things that we have to make sure that we understand is absolutely critical is you got to look good while you're doing it. And that's where True Classic comes in, because True Classic is the proud sponsor of today's episode. So if you go to trueclassic.com/Nick, you're going to get a whole array of some of the best attire you will ever see. And I'm telling you right now, you feel better when you know the stuff you're wearing actually looks good and fits right. I've been wearing True Classic workout gear, t-shirts, button-ups, pants, shorts, the whole deal for a while now because I absolutely love their product. Plus, you can also find it now at major outlets. They're into Target now. They're in Costco now. So if you're the typical middle-aged guy that likes to shop at Costco, you can actually find some good stuff at Costco now. But if you really want to sign up to get the best deals possible, go to trueclassic.com/Nick. Check out what they got. Again, I'm a big fan. All right, Christian, kick us off here with kind of this explanation of what is Polybius's theory of anacyclosis.
So, you hinted at it in the introduction. Over 2,000 years ago, actually like 2,100 years ago, the Greek philosopher and historian Polybius, he was sent to Rome as a hostage because he was not originally a Roman himself. He was a Greek. And spoiler alert, the Greeks were conquered by the Romans. So he's sent to Rome as a hostage, but he's really treated more as like an honored guest, wise figure. And he watches the Romans kind of mop up the Mediterranean. They've been doing this for his whole entire life, but the second half of his life, they kind of complete the process, right? They defeat the Carthaginians. They basically conquer a majority of the Greek states. They're well on their way to kind of creating the borders of what we eventually call the Roman Empire. And he's very honest about it when he writes his book, The Histories. Book 6, which I read in anticipation of this podcast, he asks actually at the beginning of it, let's see if I could just bring it up here at the start. He asks straight up the question. He says that, that he wants to figure out what on earth allowed in 53 years the Romans to basically overcome the entire world and dominate everybody around them. And he's concluding that what allowed Rome to defeat the Carthaginians, unify the Italian peninsula, defeat the Greek city-states, is that they have a unique political system that so many others did not have. And that political system allowed them to transcend what he called the anacyclosis, which is a cycle of constitutions. And his argument is that all civilizations and all peoples and all governments go through a particular cycle. One form of government devolving into kind of its evil twin, and then that evil twin is overthrown by another form of government, which then devolves into its evil twin, which then continues on and on and on until finally you arrive back at the same place that you began.
So it's cyclical in the sense that he's identified certain forms of government, and you could almost argue it's like each one of these like three forms has what you might call a positive manifestation and a negative manifestation. And his argument is you start off with the positive, and over time you devolve into the negative, which ushers in a different one.
A different positive.
So what does that look like?
So you start with monarchy as the system that he begins with. So you can already tell why I might be a fan. But so Polybius argues basically that over time people come together and they form communities. And within those communities, you have people that rise to the top because of their talents or their intellect or their strength or their courage, their leadership abilities. And that the best among those end up being elevated to the highest of leadership positions. And so over time, you have an organic monarchy that's established, not because somebody necessarily takes power and rules like a tyrant, but because people willingly and voluntarily start obeying and respecting what they have to say because they view them as being wise, as being courageous, as being kind of the best of the best within the community.
So it's meritocratic.
It's a meritocratic monarchy.
Yeah.
In the sense that you start with one person emerges, the cream of the crop, and the community rallies around that person and gives them a leadership position because they trust them.
Yeah.
And so this person becomes the first king of a community. Now, this person typically does a very good job. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in there to begin with. And so the system works pretty well at the beginning because he's kind of embodying all the different values and belief systems that community already believes in. And so it's not tyrannical at all. Like we, as Americans, we have a hard time thinking about this because we pride ourselves on, well, we're a republic.
Yeah.
On the right, we say we're a republic, not a democracy. On the left, they'll say we're, it's our democracy. But nobody, unless you're a weirdo like me, nobody's out there screaming for a king, right? We pride ourselves on having overthrown one 250 years ago. But remember, the Romans at one point had a king as well. They prided themselves on not being a monarchy as well at a certain point, which gets to Polybius's cycle. And so again, it sounds alien to us, but we have to think about this from the concept of like servant leadership.
Yeah.
And so what we're articulating here is not a tyrant. We're articulating somebody that is in a position of authority because people trust them and are bestowing that position of authority upon them.
Well, and I think it's also important to, if you go to the book of 1 Samuel, I think it's 1 Samuel, where the Israelites are asking for a king, and he's kind of warning them about what happens with that. But if you look at the reason why they wanted it, a lot of it had to do with what they thought it would provide in the forms of protection. So for, again, Americans that have grown up in a republic and have kind of this anti-attitude toward monarchy, for a lot of places, monarchy was actually seen as a very legitimate and a very stable form of government that was there to protect the people, provided that you had a wise and noble monarch. And so when we look at it in that historical context, I think we can have some appreciation for why it existed and, why it was seen as a positive thing. So how does he get into the idea of it devolving?
So this is where you get the evil twin of monarchy, which is tyranny. Now, again, us in the United States, we too often kind of associate the two as being one and the same, but the ancient Greeks did not. The ancient Greeks said that monarchy is virtuous and just. It's a legitimate form of government, and tyranny is an illegitimate form of government. It's despotic rule by one individual. So that's why I said it's kind of the evil twin of monarchy.
Yeah.
And the cycle devolves into tyranny because the first king that's lifted up by a community, he's almost certainly a good person that is doing his best for the community. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been uplifted in the first place. And Polybius goes on to point out that it is very well the case that his successors might actually continue it, and in some cases might even be better off than him. He points out that at the start of a community, they might value strength and physical courage and leadership over anything else, but maybe future generations value wisdom beyond just physical strength. And so the sons or the grandsons of the king might be more of what Plato would call the philosopher king, where he's out there, he's building the walls, he's laying the groundwork for cities, he's constructing castles to defend his lands with, but he's also engaging in the arts and philosophy, and he's encouraging learning. And so in some ways the system actually gets better, but if it keeps going on, it might take 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 generations. It might take a century, maybe even 2 centuries. But eventually the system devolves into tyranny, because a day will come where the kings inherit their power and they have no memory of their great-great-great-grandfather who was this wise and virtuous ruler that, brought, peace and plenty upon the land. Instead, they're just looking around and they're like, well, I was born into this position. I don't have any loyalty to the people. I'm just going to start basically getting mine, right? I'm going to tax them. I'm going to impose unjust laws on them. I'm going to be a tyrant. I'm going to conscript them into the army to go conquer my neighbor just to make myself look good.
So would you describe the distinction, and one of the distinctions that Polybius is making between monarchy and tyranny? One is it's not a difference with respect to necessarily the structure of government, but rather the virtue of the leader.
Yes.
So it's this idea that the monarch in his example, and again, there can be a spectrum of what monarchy looks like, from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, et cetera.
Well, and like, where would a dictator fall into this?
Well, but that's the point that I'm kind of getting into right now, is that he's not necessarily saying that a good monarch is one that is a constitutional monarchy. It may be an absolute monarch, but it's the reason upon which they have ascended the throne, combined with a genuine concern for the people, combined with kind of this, wise, brave, more like all of the chief virtues, right? And so that's a good monarch. The tyrant, it's not that they have a completely different system of power. It's just that their motivations for holding that power and the reasons why they hold that power are essentially devoid of the wisdom, the meritocracy, all of the other things that distinguished it from the monarch. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, I feel like a tyrant you can have in many different forms of government. It's not just monarch versus tyrant. It's more like,
oh, don't worry, we're gonna get there.
Yeah,
like tyrant versus a virtuous on any of these things. So isn't the difference between a king and a dictator is kingship is usually passed down generationally or chosen in that respect?
In the modern sense.
And then
in the
but
modern sense, we
dictators sort of
differentiate.
gather the power for themselves.
Not necessarily.
So, I mean, you said it, so I'll just briefly bring it up. One example that we'll get to once we finish the cycle is what happened in Spain in the 1930s, where they sped run the cycle literally like in 10 years.
Yeah.
They went from monarchy to all the other stuff that we're going to get to that I'm not going to spoil.
So we've made
they ended with dictatorship.
We've made the distinction between what Polybius describes as like the virtuous monarch versus the descension into, or the devolution into the unvirtuous tyrant.
Mm-hmm.
Now he gets into, so that's kind of like the first phase. So what's phase 2?
Okay, so phase 2 is, well, people get sick of the tyrant, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point about dictator, the ancients had a different conception of dictatorship than we do. We say dictator today is like a military strongman that comes in. Dictator back then meant something different than tyrant. A dictator actually meant somebody that was operating outside of the traditional monarchical system, but was kind of granted emergency powers to act like a monarch. And the Romans had a system like that, which we might talk about.
And there wasn't like a negative connotation with it.
There could be, but it wasn't guaranteed. In the modern sense, we associate dictatorship as just synonymous with tyrant.
Saddam Hussein.
But the ancients did not associate them as the same. Tyrant was something very different.
We talked about this with Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was given dictatorial powers in order to save the republic. And so, again, it's important for us to kind of put away our modern conception of these titles and look at how Polybius looked at it. So, again, the distinction is not monarchy versus dictator. The distinction is monarchy versus tyrant.
Yes.
Okay.
So tyrant, obviously people don't settle for that forever.
Yeah.
What inevitably happens is that people are sick of the tyrant acting like a tyrant, and so they cut him down. But it's not they that cut him down. It's not the people that overthrow him. It's usually an elite that overthrows the tyrant. And so these are usually members of the military or they're landowning aristocrats. And so they set up a new system where they don't just install another king. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the cycle of kingship will last a long time where the aristocrats will depose a king and just put another one in.
Yeah.
This happened with the Persians, actually, quite often, who were arch enemies of Rome for most of history. But eventually, Polybius argues that the aristocrats are just sick and tired of installing another king that might turn into another tyrant, and so then they just seize power for themselves. Now, he points out this is actually a legitimate system of government. And again, this seems alien to us as Americans. We say, well, why would we want to be ruled over by aristocrats? We're Americans. We're all equal.
Yeah.
Polybius argues that aristocracy, just like monarchy is the virtuous and just rule of one, aristocracy is the virtuous and just rule of a few. But he would argue it's a legitimate system of government because at first, the aristocrats who overthrow the monarch and now seize power for themselves, yes, they seize power for themselves, but they're not just governing for themselves.
Yeah.
They're still governing for the community. They're governing for the state that they're a part of. They're the upper crust of society, but they're continuing the good work that maybe the king's grandfather or great-grandfather did. And so the aristocrats are governed by the same set of virtues and principles that the monarchy used to represent, that it has now devolved into tyranny. And so they can't reinstate the monarch because they've associated it with tyranny, but they kind of carry on the work of the monarch. And so Polybius argues that this is a legitimate form of government. It's the rule of the few, but it's still governed by the same set of principles and duties and obligations that the monarch used to carry out personally. But over time, the sons and the grandsons of the aristocrats lose sight of why the revolution to overthrow the monarch took place in the first place. And so then they inherit the vast estates and they inherit all the offices that are just kind of handed down through hereditary privilege. And they inherit all the sums of wealth that their parents or grandparents accumulated. They're the 1% in society. And I don't mean this in the Occupy Wall Street sense, but they're kind of born into a system that they didn't have to defend or set up at all. And some of them might do a good job. In fact, in many cases they can for a few generations, but you eventually get to a point, it might take 1 or 2 or 3 generations, but eventually the sons or the grandsons or the great-grandsons of the aristocrats become tyrants themselves. So now instead of 1 tyrant, you have 100 tyrants or 1,000 tyrants. And this devolves into what Polybius calls the corrupt rule of the few instead of the virtuous rule of the few. And this is what he associates with oligarchy. And he describes, in my notes, my summary of it, he says that the sons inherit power, everything begins to change. This new generation is raised in privilege. They've never experienced the tyranny or the hardship or the burden of earning the public's trust. They grow up to be entitled, detached from the people, and insulated from criticism. And as a result, they become arrogant, corrupt, and self-indulgent. Some pursue wealth at any cost. Others lose themselves in vice. Power becomes private property. And what began as a rule of few degenerates into a rule of what began as a rule of a virtuous few degenerates into a rule of a corrupt few, which is what he calls an oligarchy.
And again, I what is interesting about this is that you can look at forms of aristocracy and you can actually point to like the early Roman Republic. It's not like as if everyone got to play in that game, right?
It was the patricians.
It was the patricians, the members of the Senate. But as long as those members were ruling in a way that was considered fair and just, that was a proper manifestation of rule by the few in the form of aristocracy. And again, modern ears, American, we automatically almost associate aristocracy with either royalty or with forms of oligarchy. It's this idea of unearned privilege within society. And he makes this distinction that's like, well, no. And if you even look at American, elements of American history, right? It wasn't all just the shopkeepers that got together. You have this group of men within the American Revolution, right? Your Madisons, your Adams, your Jeffersons, your Washingtons, your Rutledges, like all these people that were considered kind of the upper echelons of society. You could have very easily considered them to be among the aristocracy. But again, it's that, what's the difference? The difference is not so much the structure of the government as it is the virtue of the people in charge and the purpose by which they see the maintenance of their position. And so again, it's once again very easy to see. You see this sometimes too within the we talk about this within the private sector, within businesses, where you'll see one generation, build a business. You'll see it maybe the next generation really, expand it or include, and then by the third or fourth generation, it's sold off or bankrupted. And so once again, there's this loss of meaning and purpose for why you have this authority, what it's for, devolving into, well, it's just for me. So it's almost like this self-centered approach to why the power exists and why you should wield it. So once we go from the aristocracy to the oligarchy, what's the next step?
So by this point, the people start noticing a pattern. We had rule of one turned into tyranny. We had rule of a few turned into just a different form of tyranny, a corrupt oligarchy. So now we're going to overthrow the aristocracy. And as I write that, people end up noticing that corruption, decadence, and indifference, they're all sparking the same type of outrage that led to the toppling of the monarchy to begin with. And so fed up with kings and aristocrats alike, populism swells and people refuse to hand over power to any single person or even a small group. The only remaining option is themselves. So they turn to democracy, ruled by the people. And by the way, this is why we associate monarchy with tyranny and aristocracy with oligarchy today. Mm-hmm. Because take a guess what part of the cycle we're in.
Yeah.
We're not in the monarchy cycle or the aristocracy cycle. And so Polybius argues that eventually, when you get to the democracy stage of the cycle, the people that are now running the system for themselves, because they've kind of been burned twice, they actually associate, rather than looking at the entire scheme of history, they associate monarchy with tyranny. Mm-hmm. They associate aristocracy with oligarchy. They do not differentiate between these systems at all. They simply say these things were all bad, and that's the whole reason we staged a revolution and created a government by, for, and through the people to begin with.
Yeah.
And so we keep having to have these caveats that I know that as an American, we look at this and say, it is a certain way. There's a reason we do that, because the same impulse that drives us to say kings are tyrants and aristocracies are oligarchies is the same impulse that drove the Roman people when they overthrew Tarquin the Proud and said, we will never stomach a king ever again, or when the succession of the plebs took place. And they basically marched out and said, you're on your own if you're not going to give us rights. Yeah. We're going to protest against the aristocratic system that the patricians had set up. And we're going to demand equal protection and privilege and rights. Well, again, we are associating these prior forms of government with their degenerated twin. And so the system eventually devolves into a democracy because they're sick and tired of one tyrant or a few petty tyrants. And so lacking any alternatives, they just decide, okay, then I guess we're going to rule ourselves. And so then it goes on to say that at first the system works. Those who remember the oppression of the past treasure equality and freedom. And this is actually a point that Polybius, I don't have the direct quote, but there's a line where Polybius says that one of the chief principles that is upheld as like the highest good is freedom and liberty and equality and freedom of speech and basically civic liberties and freedoms. That is like the most important principle that's enshrined in a democracy, because they're looking at the past and they're saying we need these things. And I think he's right about that. And so then he goes on to say that they value open debate, civic participation, and the idea that no one is above the law. But I think I hope our audience has established a recurring pattern here, because the democracy does not last. If you're a Democrat that's listening, you might want to tune away now. But and if you're a Republican, you might know where we're going with this, because the democracy does not last forever. So once a new generation, notice a pattern here. Once a new generation comes in, one that's raised entirely within the system, they take democracy's benefits for granted. They forget what it took to keep the system running. And some begin to chase power not through service or merit, but by gaming the system.
Yeah.
Polybius argues that the ones most tempted by that are the rich. And he says that those that are unable to gain office through their achievements begin using their vast sums of money to buy influence and corrupt the public with favors, handouts, and bribes. But he doesn't just stop at criticizing the rich or the 1% or the wealthy, because he says it takes two to tango here,
Yeah.
because the people are just as guilty of destroying and corrupting the system as well, because who's being bought with the favors of the wealthy?
Yeah.
It's the people. And he goes on to say that the people become complicit in it. They learn to expect rewards, and they start voting themselves spoils from the public treasury. And so then he concludes that democracy ends up rotting from the inside. And eventually the system breaks down. The mob is no longer capable of justice or equality. All that it seeks is spoils. It demands more and more from others until its only qualification for leadership is the ability to satisfy the crowd's appetite. And Polybius concludes that from this, you get chaos. You get riots, land seizures, show trials, exile and execution, the total collapse of social norms and civic norms, and eventually the end of the rule of law itself. And so finally, the cycle is complete. You arrive at the destination, which is democracy devolving into mob rule. And Polybius says, of all the unjust systems of government, tyranny and oligarchy included, mob rule is the absolute worst of all of them, because you have a tyranny of one where you might be able to escape the tyrant's grip because he might be distracted with something from time to time. He's only one person after all. And then the tyranny of the few. Well, they might just be interested in just accumulating wealth. They're building vast estates for themselves. They're earning privilege on the battlefield or having monuments built after them. But how can one escape the tyranny of everyone? How can you survive the tyranny of the mob? They'll hunt you down.
Can I ask a question? One of our members said, let's see. How does the advent of bureaucracy and technocracy, did I say that wrong, affect this model?
In many respects, the growth of the bureaucratic state is the beginning of the degeneration of the democracy.
Like creating positions for themselves.
It's
power.
Well, you need a certain level of administration when you're running anything. But the problem is when the bureaucracy becomes its own constituency. So it's one thing to say that the bureaucracy exists in order to manage the legitimate functions and administrative responsibilities of a system of government. It's another thing when the bureaucracy grows at a rate and secures for itself a certain degree of power to where now it becomes the actual seat of power. In fact, if you want an interesting and some interesting examples of this that took on a militaristic is the Mamelukes in Egypt and the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire. The Janissaries were essentially foreign slaves that were brought in to be not just soldiers of the Ottoman sultans, but also administrators. Well, over time, when the Ottoman Empire needed to update and modernize, it was the Janissaries, right? These original slave soldiers and administrators of the Ottoman Empire that essentially had worked themselves in and created such a control over the mechanisms of government that they essentially strangled out the Ottoman Empire from being able to modernize and make necessary adjustments in order to protect their own privileged position. So I would argue that what ends up happening with the bureaucracy, it almost ends up becoming this kind of silent oligarchy within a system. The other manifestation I think you see within democracy is there's a quote by Alexander Tytler that's said a lot. It goes, a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote for themselves largesse from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that democracy always collapses over loose fiscal policy, always followed by a dictatorship. Now, what's interesting to consider here is that because all forms of government require some bureaucracy, the question then becomes is which forms of government then allow for that bureaucracy to essentially gain this incredible foothold. And Thomas Sowell talks a lot about this, that it's important to understand that bureaucracies themselves have their own interests. And so they end up operating as kind of like this separate wing. So even though you have Polybius's three models, and a lot of that focuses on the actual apparatus of who has the power, in each one, there's this bureaucratic desire to gain more power and more security and more wealth for itself, which ends up being a corrupting influence on that type of government.
I think a massive bureaucratic state is sort of an indication of how far down the road we are.
Yes,
and
it
and
is.
then
It's a corrupting
there was also
influence. I'll put it this way. You should look at the bureaucracy as the positive form of the bureaucracy is the necessary administrative components that are put in place in order to carry out the legitimate functions of a moral government. The negative manifestation of bureaucracy is its own entrenched interest now using the power of government for its own benefits at the expense of people.
Okay.
So bureaucracy actually has its own positive and negative manifestations.
Next question. What's a prime example of tyranny of mob rule?
Late stage French Revolution.
Yeah.
The Reign of Terror, the Jacobins. So actually, hang on, before we jump into some examples.
Yeah, I was just asking the question from
the
our
last
people.
stage. No, and it was a good question. I'll get to it in just a second. So the last stage is you get to mob rule, which Polybius warns. In fact, actually, there's a line here at the very end of his histories that I'll just read from, because he does quite a good job of explaining it. He says that when a commonwealth, after warding off many great dangers, has arrived at a high pitch of prosperity and undisputed power, it is evident that by the lengthened continuance of great wealth within it, the manner of the life of its citizens will become more extravagant, and that the rivalry for office and in other spheres of activity will become fiercer than it ought to be. And as this state of things goes on more and more, the desire of office and the shame of losing reputation, as well as the ostentation and extravagance of living, will prove the beginning of a deterioration. And of this change, the people will be credited with being the authors when they become convinced that they are being cheated by some from avarice and are puffed up with flattery by others from love of office. For when that comes about, and their passionate resentment and acting under the dictates of anger, they will refuse to obey any longer or to be content with having equal powers with their leaders, but will demand to have all or far the greatest themselves. And when that comes to pass, the Constitution will receive a new name, which sounds better than any other in the world, liberty or democracy, but in fact will become the worst of all governments, mob rule.
Jeez. It is. When you think about how long ago he wrote that and the examples that he was utilizing in order to come to that conclusion, and then you think about the state of discourse in this country, and you think about I think of the arguments that I hear from my colleagues in the General Assembly
2,100 years after he wrote this.
That's what describes it. That is what describes it.
I'm saying you rhetorically, but
yeah.
you get why we're talking about this today, because this was written before Christ.
Yeah.
This was written before the Roman Empire.
Well, before the incarnation. But
yeah, but you get like this was written like 1st century BC.
Yeah.
And the predictive staying power, if you just read it in a way, like I get that the language is a little bit old in some places. It's obviously an English translation as well, right? He wasn't writing in English, but it's almost like he's describing the world today. And so to the original question, well, what stage in the process are we?
Yeah.
Well, we're either in late stage democracy or early stage mob rule.
Yeah.
It's hard to look at what happened in 2020, for example, and say that's not a manifestation of mob rule.
Yeah.
You had politicians bowing before the mob. And the Democratic vice presidential candidate, his wife jokingly said, and I can't believe she said this, that she opened the windows to her home in order to smell the burning fires of downtown Minneapolis in the summer of 2020. Like, it's hard for you to not look at the last 5 years, last 10 years even, and say that we're not moving into mob rule. And so we're either at that point or we're in late stage democracy. But no, Polybius is on point here. And I think that the reason that the anacyclosis is so important today and that people need to study these things that were written thousands of years ago is because I think he's describing not unique forms of government to his time. I think he's describing an element of the human condition.
Yeah.
because he concludes with saying it doesn't end in perpetual mob rule forever, because he concludes that eventually demagoguery devolves into kleptocracy and then kakistocracy. And eventually the system implodes under the weight of the very anarchy that it's ushered in.
Mm-hmm.
And from this chaos, a leader emerges, good or ill.
Yeah.
A leader emerges to put an end to the anarchy
Mm-hmm.
and to begin the cycle anew.
Well, and this is the part too that I want to explain to people, because Polybius is not saying that it's this, then this, then this, then this. What he's saying, it's category to category to category to category. So, for instance, democracy to mob rule doesn't automatically lead to monarchy. It can just as easily lead to
tyranny,
dictatorship, or tyranny. It can just as easily lead to tyranny. And the reason why that's important to understand is because if you recognize that, okay, we are at a stage in this process. Now, maybe we're not comfortable with the concept of monarchy, right? We certainly shouldn't be comfortable with the concept of tyranny. But it's this idea of, okay, what comes from this? Because what mob rule leads to is a level of chaos. Because some people will ask, well, why do the people accept a dictatorship? Because that's another important thing to understand here. Because when we look at the various examples, and we're going to go through a quick list here, there are times where people welcomed with open arms the dictator. Now, maybe in their minds they thought it was going to be the manifestation of monarchy. But more often than not, what we see in world history is people were so fed up with the chaos that they would accept tyranny if it meant some degree of stability. This is why I think Polybius illustrates that it's the mob rule that is even worse than the violent dictator, because at least the violent tyrant provides some element of consistency and stability. Even if it's brutal, it's something, whereas mob rule is just absolute chaos. And I think that's an important component to understand. I mean, we have several examples here. Like, really, if anybody doubted whether or not this guy's theory has played out, but again, he built it from something. It's not like he was sitting around theorizing based off of nothing. He had looked at human history all the way up to his point. And just as a real quick thing, if you ever want to have your mind blown from this idea of time, the ancient pyramids were more ancient to Polybius than Polybius is to us, right? We are closer in time to Polybius than Polybius was to the ancient when the pyramids were built. So he had a wealth of knowledge and experience in human history to look at and come up with these cycles. But what's amazing is that even with him probably perhaps doing the best job of articulating them in such a way to where they actually got generations to actually read and study them, it didn't stop the process. And this is where I think there's an arrogance that takes hold after the Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment, where we have this notion that yes, but we're better than them. We're
more civilized now.
We have unlocked.
We've evolved.
We've evolved and truly unlocked human understanding and thinking and this widespread knowledge and understanding and application of the scientific method and our ability to dispel these old
we're
ideas.
Past all that.
These old ideas. Well, wait a second.
We even say that about like the World War II era. We even say we're past all that. I mean,
but my point is that in the Enlightenment, it's that these people were driven by superstition and a lack of understanding of the physical universe and physical reality and the formulation of all of these thoughts. And we have, elevated beyond that. And then you look at what has actually happened since the Enlightenment, because you end up realizing that if we look at examples of this cycle, you have ancient Greece, but then like 1640s England, 1790s France, 1900s Russia, 1930s Spain, some of the most brutal, some of the absolutely most brutal manifestations of this cycle are all post-Enlightenment.
The largest body counts in history take place after, not before the Enlightenment.
There is this quote, I can't remember who it was by, I'll try to look it up later, but it was this idea that it was the concern that our mastery of the physical world, our mastery of the scientific method and industrialization, all these other times, have created, have essentially created more effective means to hitherto not better ends. That essentially when you look at Polybius's cycle, that our understanding of certain things and our ability to develop these better means didn't mean that it automatically came with better ends. It didn't mean that we had overcome human nature. Our ability to overcome the physical world did not automatically manifest us with better morals or better end states. Perhaps it should have, but it obviously did not.
One that's left off though. There's more that could have been added to this list when I wrote it. Like we could have added 1920s and 30s Germany.
Yeah.
Right. They replaced a Kaiser for a Führer eventually. Yeah. If you think deeply enough about it, there's so many instances. You could look at China.
Yeah.
From the revolution that topples the Qing dynasty to Mao taking over.
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line is that, and that's the other thing that's important here, right? Is a lot of the examples that we read off are Western in nature, but this process is not isolated to the West. You see it taking place across space, time, and cultures. And that's where I think you can really zero into this idea that, look, there is something kind of baked into human nature here that we have to contend with. So this leads me to the second part of this, right? Why did Polybius think that Rome had potentially figured out a way to break this cycle?
So interestingly enough, this was the ultimate question that he himself asked when he started. And I brought this up when I showed the very beginning of book 6 of the histories that he wrote. He's very honest and upfront at the very start. And he's like, look, the purpose of what I'm writing is to try to uncover how the Romans managed to conquer almost the entire known world by the time that he's writing this.
Yeah.
How did they defeat so many people and hold themselves together and avoid the collapse, the implosion of the Greek world, for example?
Yeah.
And he concludes that the reason why is because they're drawing from the best of each of the 3 positive aspects of the system.
So instead of pretending as if you could hang out in one of these forms and just keep it perpetually good, perpetually virtuous, they essentially said, okay, there's negative manifestations of all 3. How do we encapsulate the positive manifestations of all 3?
Yeah, so he says that depending on the aspect that you look at within the Roman constitution, if you look at it from a certain point of view, you would say it's a monarchy. If you look at it from another point of view, you would say it's an aristocracy. And if you look at it from a third point of view, you would say it's a democracy. And he would say that is the Roman Republic. He calls it the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
And his argument is effectively that this is creating a system, in a way, an ancient form of checks and balances. Mm-hmm. It's drawing from the strengths of all 3 in order to avoid the disintegration into the negative manifestations of all 3 of them. I actually have a chart here that I want to just briefly show. It's kind of complex, but
yeah.
This is kind of the constitution of the Roman Republic around the time of when Polybius is writing about this. And he says that, again, it looks complicated, and I'll try to explain it for the audio listeners, not just those that are watching on YouTube. But you have, for example, the legislative branch here. So you have assemblies, you have the Senate. The Senate is the manifestation of the aristocracy.
Yeah.
It's the wisest men within the Republic that are holding these esteemed offices, and they're in charge of great matters of state. They're in charge of a lot of things related to like foreign treaties and diplomacy and managing the city, the capital, the city of Rome itself. They kind of give a lot of orders. The Senate issues instructions to all the magistrates other than the tribunes. And so they're very powerful and important, at least back then.
Yeah.
Later on, they kind of lose a lot of their power. But he points out, though, that you have tribal assemblies and plebeian councils. And this represents the democracy aspect of it. So the Senate might be the aristocracy having a say, but the assemblies or the people, they're the plebs that have a say. And the plebs don't just have a say within assemblies. Yes, assemblies have a significant amount of power when it comes to checking these other things, but really the plebs also have their own champions. They have something called the tribunes. There's a tribune of the plebs. And the tribune of the plebs kind of have like absolute veto power over any of the other 4 assemblies. They can just simply say no. Well, and that shuts it down.
And this was an agreement that took place because originally when you had more of what you would call so you had the fall of the last monarchy and you really move into this idea of aristocracy. And there was a point where the aristocracy and the patricians could essentially dictate everything to the plebs. And it was a pleb revolt that essentially said, no, we need to have a say in this process. And they essentially won it. And it was not an insignificant amount of power that the plebeian tribunes had. It was significant. It was a significant check on aristocratic power.
And so the purpose of the tribune of the plebs is to protect the people. I mean, the Romans enshrined it that like to lay a finger on a tribune of the pleb is like to profane the gods themselves. Like we're going to kill you if you violate their office.
Well, and can we also add another component here that I think is important, because we're going to have to discuss this later when we talk about our own situation. There was an incredibly important role that religion played into the Roman system. So it is totally inappropriate. And again, we would look at a lot of the Roman religion and we would think it's highly superstitious and a little bit absurd at times. You know, you had like the chickens that you had to consult, the sacred chickens you had to consult, or the goat's entrails or whatever else it was. But the reason why that's important is because the Romans assigned a deeply religious aspect to this political structure. And so and that was important as a check on human ambition, because if you did this, if you laid a hand on the tribune, if you did these things, you were not just punished in this lifetime. You had violated the sacred, aspect of the gods, and you would be punished, and all of Rome would be punished, right? For this violation of the gods. And so they saw this strong theological connection to enforcing the political structure that they had put in place.
Oh yeah. In fact, actually, on that point, I'll just jump to it, because you you really hit the nail on the head right there. That one of the things, if you read Polybius's histories here, one of the things that he stresses over and over and over again is that the Romans are successful because they're a moral and religious people.
Yeah.
That the Roman system has been intact, that mixed, what he calls a mixed government, a mixed constitution that is drawing from monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy in order to create a harmonious system of a hierarchy, but also a system of checks and balances within it. He's stressing that the Romans believe in this.
Yeah.
They believe it is sacred. They believe that, yes, men have created this system. It wasn't like handed down from the gods, but it is creating a system that fits within a harmonious cosmic order that is greater than just themselves.
Yeah.
And they're playing their little small role within it as individuals, and that this system is good for them as a people. And so it's not just a utilitarian thing, but there is a philosophical, moral, and religious component of it that is seamlessly integrated into the political structure.
Yeah.
This is not a secular state at all.
No. Well, and to give you, and again, to give everyone an example of how much the Romans believed this, at a time during the Roman Republic when they were fighting, I can't remember if it was the First or Second Punic War, one of the consuls, Regulus, went down to North Africa, was winning battles, and then all of a sudden lost one, got captured. Carthage allowed Regulus to go back to Rome with the purpose of convincing the Roman Senate to stop the war. But he had to swear an oath by the gods before he went. Regulus went back to Rome, did the opposite of what he was asked to do, which he actually encouraged the Senate to continue the war. And then he voluntarily got back on a ship, went back to Carthage, and was tortured to death. And he saw that as his sacred duty, both to his religion and to Rome. So understand, this was not just there's a lot of modern movies where they always want to treat Romans' treatment of religion as if, all the smart people knew it was all bogus. No, they believed in it. They believed in it. It had true effect into the way that they conducted themselves.
Here's the direct line from Polybius near the end of his essay, and he says, but the quality in which the Roman Commonwealth is most distinctly superior, in my opinion, he's writing comparisons to other constitutions. He's talking about Carthage, Sparta, Athens, Thebes, the Macedonians. He's comparing the Roman system to other political systems that have either previously existed or might still exist. And he's saying that the Roman system is vastly superior to all others.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that he gives is he says that the quality in which the Roman Commonwealth is most distinctly superior, in my opinion, is the nature of their religious convictions. I believe it is the very thing which among other peoples is an object of reproach. I mean superstition, which maintains the cohesion of the Roman state.
Yeah.
By the way, our founding fathers read all of Polybius, like over and over again. In fact, there's letters from John Adams to other friends of his where he says that the greatest object of his life in the realm of politics is to study and understand this in order to hopefully avoid the same fate that befell Rome. Because Polybius got some things right. This is our second question, right? He got some things right. What made the Roman system work? The Roman system worked because, going back to our constitution here, it drew from monarchy in the form of the consuls and the praetors and the censors and the quaestors, the top of the hierarchy of the executive branch. That's the monarchical system. The consuls had extensive executive powers. It also drew from aristocracy in the form of the Senate and arguably things like the Century Assembly. And so these are positions that are filled by the wisest men within the Republic. And it drew from democracy. This is in the form of the lower assemblies, the tribal assemblies, the plebeian councils, the tribune of the plebs. And all of these systems work together and they check each other and they create a harmonious system where you avoid, for a very long time, a devolving into tyranny or oligarchy or mob rule. And then the other component that Polybius emphasizes over and over again is the Romans are a moral and religious people that believe in this system, associated with it not just a utilitarian function. They are not a secular people. It is not a secular state, but they truly believe in it. There's a unified culture, a unified moral, religious, and philosophical foundation that provides a grounding for this system to work. The system doesn't work unless the people believe in it.
Yeah.
But the people believe in it is what he's stressing.
Yeah.
But here's the danger. At the end of book 6, he has his conclusion. And he says that all existing things are subject to decay and change is a truth that scarcely needs proof, for the course of nature is sufficient to force this conviction upon us. There being two agencies, which again we described earlier, external and internal. And then again, he concluded that he's hinting at the very end that having dealt with the origin and the growth of the Republic and where it's today, I'm going to end my essay, but he stresses that nobody is safe from the cycle, that the Roman system buys them time, centuries, rather than years or decades like in many other systems. But he concludes that the Roman state is just like a person, all people. It's mortal. And some people live longer than others. Some organisms live longer than others. Some systems last longer than others. But Polybius is under no delusions. There are multiple quotes in here. He is under no delusions that the Roman system is not perfect in the sense that it is timeless and that it'll last forever. He believes that it is arguably the greatest system that has ever been devised up to his point in time. He says that repeatedly.
Yeah.
But he's under no delusion that it's more than likely going to eventually devolve like all the others, just because he thinks that this is a part of the human condition.
Well, and that kind of leads us into this third part, right? And that's understanding where the United States is on this system. And we've already kind of hinted at it's either late stage democracy, potentially moving into mob rule in some aspects, right? We get, again, I don't think we're in mob rule, but I honestly do think that we're in a position where when you look at things like 2020 and mobs literally going through the streets and burning things down with the approval of various members of the government. When you look at kind of that statement we read earlier from Tytler about the idea that democracy fails the moment that people can realize that they can vote for themselves, gifts from the treasury, and now it all becomes this idea of the majority picking whatever politicians promise them the most. The other thing that I would say is, the most important part that I shouldn't say the most important part. Well, no, ultimately it is. What is the glue that holds all this together? And again, it's the sacred. John Adams said it of the United States. Our Constitution is written for a moral and religious people and is totally unsuited to the government of any other. And we say that now, and we have, people sometimes on the right cringe at that. It's the idea that, well, no, we don't need God. It's like, oh, okay, because why? Because we've advanced beyond it, because our understanding of the physical universe is so far superior to the ancients that it has now led us to what more intelligent conclusions. Now, I think as we also look at the Roman religion, I think also something is very important here is that the sacred can be a glue to hold you together, but ultimately the primary question for this, just like with everything else, is, okay, but what's true? And bad religion can hold you together, but it can ultimately lead to bad ends. It can devolve into whether it be superstition or tyranny or anything else. And I think that one of the primary questions that needs to be asked when we look at questions of human nature, and the reason why the religious component is so important, is because what is true? Because if a religion, and I obviously believe it's Christianity, is true, well, then it informs us about the nature of human frailty, of human nature, and it gives us actually solutions to this, which are really important. But I want to talk real quick about how Rome fell, because at this point, Polybius is saying, look, if anybody has found out a way to break the system, to break the cycle, it's Rome, and yet he didn't fully believe that even Rome could withstand it.
And remember, he's writing he's writing about a generation before the Gracchi show up.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the beginning of what we call the crisis of the Roman Republic, this 100-year period between the Gracchi and Augustus.
So what do we identify? What do we identify as the components of why Rome then started on this decline?
So I have a couple points here from reading Polybius that I gleaned from his analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the interesting thing is, these are all assumptions that I think he ends up being proven correct on because he doesn't live to see it.
Yeah.
But the first point is the decline of virtue. So the Roman elites ended up trading duty for luxury. We were talking about all the sacrifice that they put forward for the greater good. And I don't mean that in a socialistic or communistic sense. I mean it in an organic community sense. I mean, there's so many instances throughout Roman history where even the elites in that society will basically, throw themselves on their swords if it means saving the nation,
saving the republic,
right? Like I mean, the Romans get destroyed at Cannae against Hannibal, and what do? Well, I guess we just got to raise another army.
Yeah,
like nobody contemplated surrender.
I don't think people have a proper understanding of how devastating Cannae was. When you lose upwards of, I mean, we're not talking about a nation of 300 million people like the United States. We're talking about a system at that point that probably was maybe 10 million people, maybe not even that at that particular stage in Roman history.
It's probably even less than that.
To lose 50,000 people in a day, to include the cream of your aristocracy, would have been enough to destroy any other civilization at that point. And yet, Rome didn't even get sacked.
And if you're the cream of the crop that didn't die,
yeah,
and you just saw all your brothers and your uncles and maybe your father get killed on a battlefield, you might be thinking, well, I just need to save my own skin. Why would I want to go volunteer to be killed next? And yet the elites in Roman society did that. And so the decline of that level of virtue, when you have that type of unity between the ruling class, the elite classes, and the people, and when they're on the same page to that degree, incredible things can be achieved. An example, I'll use a modern example, the founding of our country.
Yeah.
We have this myth, and it's wrong, and people might be upset at me for pointing this out, but it's wrong, this idea that we, the people, overthrew the British. No, we had a ruling class that overthrew the British. We had an elite that overthrew the British.
We did.
They were called our founding fathers. Our founding fathers, under Italian elite theory, Mosca would say, that's your ruling class, that's your elite. Now, these are all continental phrases that we're unfamiliar with as Americans, but that was the case. They were the ruling class. The difference is that, again, we in our modern egalitarian position, we view this as a negative thing. So when I say the founding fathers were an elite, they were a ruling class, we associate ruling class and elite as bad things.
Yeah.
But that's my whole point, because they weren't a self-interested, selfish ruling class. They loved this country. They even, and on the Declaration of Independence, they said, we're staking our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor for this nation that we're trying to form.
Yeah.
And so a perfect example in the modern sense of when a ruling elite and the people are on the same page is the founding of our country.
Yeah.
But when that's gone, so to answer your question, the first point is the decline of virtue. When that's gone, you've just knocked out one of the core pillars that makes a civilization function.
Yeah.
The next point is economic centralization. So think of like land, power, and wealth being concentrated in a few hands. Now, as conservatives, as free market supporters, a lot of times we kind of cringe at this because it sounds like socialist rhetoric, right? It's like, oh, you're railing against the 1%, you're advocating for confiscating their wealth or something like that, redistribution of wealth. That's what Democrats do, right?
Yeah.
That's what socialists do. You have to understand that two things can be true simultaneously. It can be true the demagogues prey on the wealthy in order to rouse up. That's mob rule, right? That's the final stage of the process. But it can also be true that vast sums of wealth inequality does lead to a breakdown of the system organically, and that you can say, well, I'm not resentful of the wealthy because maybe they earned it. Maybe they did earn it. But there's a lot of instances where you have, this is the Cantillon effect, right? There's lots of instances where there's wealth that is unearned because it's people that are tied to the printing press, or it's people that are tied to the politicians, or people that are tied to the spoils of the system and the injustices within the system. And the fact remains, whether you think it's legitimate or not, history is filled with examples of when you have vast amounts of income inequality, like in Rome during the Gracchi period, where you had these huge estates with slave labor that were putting the common man out of business, many of whom had been fighting as soldiers in the Punic Wars, and they were now, on the streets unemployed and homeless. That creates circumstances for the system to collapse in on itself.
So I want to say one thing in here, though, that distinguishes between what we would call the socialist explanation versus like our explanation. Our explanation of that is to say, like, the socialist looks at income inequality and says that in and of itself is the evil. The free market person says that can't possibly be the evil because there's no such thing as a system where income or wealth is always distributed evenly, nor would we want it to be. If somebody works very hard, their wealth should not be equal to somebody that doesn't work at all. If somebody contributes a great deal of value to society, the just thing for happen is for the wealth to correspondingly reflect that, not to be distributed. So we recoil at the idea of hyper-egalitarianism as expressed by the socialists because we believe it's inherently unjust. The difference is that we look at these periods of time where there's enormous concentration of power. There's two things that you will always find present. Either war, invasion, and pillaging, which is essentially government. The second is government power, or your connection to government power being the primary way in which to achieve wealth. And unfortunately, what we see, again, within the American system right now is people are blaming capitalism and the free market for things that are a direct result of government policy. Because what ends up happening is when your wealth, when your ability to create wealth is tied to government power, that is a type of government, that is a type of wealth creation, or I should say wealth redistribution, which is incredibly difficult to break into because the people that have the closest access to it tend to protect it from outside competition. When you have wealth creation based off of a market system, which essentially says that I have provided I do the right things based off of using scarce resources to provide goods and services to people that want to do business with me, and my wealth is generated this way, the only way that wealth continues to grow is if I do a better job serving the people that want to do business with me. And the difference is that one of those is a just manifestation of wealth growth, and one of those is an unjust manifestation of wealth growth. And what the socialist does is they look at the wealth. The wealth is the problem. The wealth inequality is the problem. It's like, what is the mechanism that your system holds up in order to attain wealth? If it's through serving other people better, that's a just mechanism. If it's by serving the government better or by using government power at the expense of others, that's unjust, whether you do it to become incredibly wealthy or whether you do it to just basically survive in the form of welfare. And so I think what's so important is when we talk about economic centralization, we need to recognize something. That just like when Polybius talks about positive manifestation, negative manifestation, the same thing exists when we talk about economics and wealth creation. If your wealth creation comes place through a just mechanism, it is just. And if it comes through unjust mechanisms, it is unjust and wrong. And what we saw happening in Rome with the economic centralization is those that had the power or organized the law and the legal system in such a way as to benefit themselves at the expense of other people, to where now you have this massive group of people that had no chance for economic upward mobility. Didn't matter how good they were, didn't matter how smart they were, they didn't have the access to power. And that is the sort of income inequality and economic centralization that leads to rebellion.
And so, I mean, that leads into mob politics,
Yeah.
right? Which is another one of the things that Polybius is not only warning about, but we know from history leads to the collapse of the Republic. I mean, the Gracchi stir up the mob. Caesar is a member of the Populares, which basically means the populist faction. There's so many instances in the late period of the Republic where mob politics is what's dictating things. And again, that's the perfect manifestation of the final stage of the cycle. Two other points that I have here are permanent war.
Mm-hmm.
So you have things like the Marian reforms that create kind of eventually independent armies and generals that, you know, the soldiers are more loyal to the generals than they are to the Roman state and the Roman people. And this is how you eventually can get people like Sulla or Caesar taking power through coups or civil wars. And then lastly, the failure to reform. There's people like, and we've talked about this on the podcast just recently, there's people like, you know, the Gracchi, Sulla, Caesar, all of them tried to reform the system in a way, some with more nefarious intentions than others, but all of them try to reform and kind of all of them fail. And so eventually the system devolves into, well, Rome goes full circle. The story ends on the Roman side of this, before we jump to the American side, the story ends with Rome devolving into late stage democracy and mob rule, only to return to monarchy in the form of Octavian becoming Augustus, becoming the princeps, and establishing the empire.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting how the Roman Republic lasted hundreds of years, right? Polybius credits it with its ability to weather the storm because of its unique political system and its virtues and its civic religion and its actual religion. But eventually it too falls prey to the cycle that he has outlined. And it happens, incredibly, after he passes away. And so now the question is, are there parallels that exist in the US? I think that there are.
Yeah.
And are we different, or are we simply just going to perpetuate this cycle that has been around for arguably all of human history?
I think...
And we're actually not even as far through I mean, our nation is much younger. It's, you know, a lot of people will...
Yeah, but the Spanish Second Republic was also much younger, and they sped run that in 10 years.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure you can do something that requires generational hereditary kingship in 10 years.
Well, no, they started with a monarchy that they overthrew in like the early 1930s, like 1931. And then they immediately established a republic, which immediately devolved into an oligarchy, which immediately devolved into mob rule, and then turned into a civil war between the nationalists and the Republicans, who were really mostly Marxists and socialists.
So do you think we are more set up to run through it quickly? Like, we're in the republic phase right now, and we're not very old, is what I mean. Well, it's not like we've been here for 1,000 years.
Well, here's what you need to understand, though, is that we started off in the what you would call the aristocratic or the Republican version. Like we started off with that, and in fact, we started off in a system that in many respects attempted to replicate what Rome had done, and also account for some of the weaknesses within Rome. That's where we started in this process, as far as the United States is concerned. And I think that we have to give credit where credit is due in that Republican form of government that we have, which tried to do the positive manifestations of all three components, and was also heavily influenced by Christianity. People fail to realize that the vast majority of the colonies, when they became states, all had Christianity in their constitution. We're so focused on the federal constitution, which did not have that aspect, and which all of the states didn't want to have that aspect because they were afraid of one denomination of Christianity becoming dominant through the federal government. But if you look at the individual states, many of the state constitutions had religious tests for actually serving in office. Now, we can argue all day long on whether we think that's good or bad, right? In Virginia, we did not. because Thomas Jefferson enshrined the statute of religious liberty in the Virginia Constitution. But what's important to understand is whether you put it officially within the document or not, there is no question that Christianity was the dominant religious belief, and then it had inculcated in pretty much every aspect of American culture. So what did we have? We had what Polybius was talking about with respect to Rome. We had an institution that sought through the executive, legislative, and judicial branches to prevent the concentration of power, while at the same time allowing for the people to participate in the form of voting, right? Aristocracy in the form of the House and the Senate, right? And the monarchy in the form of the executive. So they're trying to do the positive manifestations with a strong religious culture that allows for self-regulation. The idea that to violate some of these things is to not just violate the rule of law, it is to violate the sacred, because you're not supposed to be, violent. You're not supposed to steal. You're not supposed to do, and just look at the Ten Commandments. Now, what happens when you're at this stage in the process where you do have a massive federal bureaucracy, where you do have a significant portion of the population that sees the state as something that they live off of at the expense of everybody else? And by the way, I'm not just talking about people on welfare. I'm also talking about members of the aristocracy or the corporate side that also see the government as something that they should live off of in the form of corporate welfare or subsidies, right? So what we're seeing is that I believe where we're at is we're seeing the positive manifestations of our system and the negative manifestations of our system fighting against one another, right? Fighting against one another for the heart and soul of what it means to be an American.
Someone also asked where England is in this cycle, having basically a figurative king.
Late stage democracy.
They're also late stage democracy. They're not a monarchy. They're not an aristocracy.
Like they keep the king around as a
purely symbolic.
Charles has no real actual power. Although it's funny, you have polling that shows Zoomers want a strong man in the UK.
They're just wealthy nobles with lots of land and the right to take from the coffers, basically. Yeah. They get paid.
No, in England,
they get paid to be figureheads.
Not even almost. The entire Western world are all democracies at this point, and many of them are arguably late stage democracies. Some of them, you could even argue, are mob rule, or getting very close to mob rule. And so, I mean, that's kind of the problem. Like, okay, I'm not saying you need to agree with me, but do you now understand why I am much more open to monarchy?
Yes.
Because to the question of where are we in the cycle and are we different or can we break out of it? Quite frankly, I don't think we're different. I think it is hubris to assume that the United States or that the American people today are different than any other person or any other system that existed in all of human history, because the founding fathers didn't come up with this out of scratch. They read Polybius. We know that they read Polybius. Yeah. We have notes from them where they're talking about Polybius. They built our system intentionally around the Roman Republic because they were terrified of the collapse of the Roman Republic. And so they looked at all these strengths, they read these notes, and they said, we need a strong civic religious system. We need a strong theological and moral and philosophical foundation. We need checks and balances. We need to be drawing from monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy to create a mixed constitution like the Romans that's suitable for our particular place and time today, right? They weren't going to come up with the plebes and stuff like that, but draw from it as much as possible, and that's what they did. But I think that the genius of Polybius's anacyclosis is not that he's talking about something unique to 2,100 years ago. I think the genius of his system is that it is timeless and eternal because it is part of the human condition. And you can come up with systems of government that will be shorter or longer. Mm-hmm. The French came up with one that only lasted 10, 15 years, where they went through
absolute monarchy to tyranny
to Napoleon.
Yeah.
And the Spanish in the 1930s sped run at an even faster time period than the French did. We are lucky and thankful that we did not go through the entire cycle in one lifetime. We are going through a cycle over a course of 250 plus years. But I don't think that we're exempt from the cycle, because I think it's part of the human condition. And so I think the positive manifestation of what will come next is hopefully we avoid tyranny.
Yeah.
And we return to monarchy and we continue the cycle again.
So here's what I'm going to advocate for, right? Because I think there's another component here that both impacted Rome and is currently impacting the United States that is absolutely critical to understanding this process, and that is debt and inflationary monetary policy. Because Rome essentially had to try to fund its expansion, had to try to eventually fund all of its wars, its civil wars, its foreign invasions with all of that. And not to mention the bread and circuses for the people. And so the only way to do that was essentially to debase their currency. And over time, that will shatter the economic unity of a people. And when you do that, and all of a sudden people go from, gosh, I really don't like who the Caesar is, to I can't feed my family and I don't even know how to at this point because I don't know what my money is going to be worth tomorrow. That's where you get into some really, really dangerous fracturing of society and violence. And so it's important to understand that we have walked along that path. So to Christian's point, I totally agree. Anybody that believes that we somehow significantly altered human nature after the Enlightenment, it is the height of arrogance to me. And that's why we're experiencing the same thing, just in different stages. However, I also think that once again, our founders did something correct. They recognized this and they tried to account for it. I think what's going on right now is not a devolving into late stage democracy. I think what's going on right now is that each stage of it, from the monarchy versus tyranny, from the aristocracy versus oligarchy, from the democracy versus mob rule, and the underlying civic, all of that has now reached a stage in the United States where the voices arguing, the voices driving us to one and driving to the other have reached an equilibrium within society. By that I mean, they never had the numbers before to pull it off, and now they do. Now the people that are pushing us toward this idea of mob rule, that are pushing us toward the idea, I don't think so much of oligarchy or tyranny, but pushing us toward the mob rule side of it, right? They've got numbers now. The other side, right? Now what we're seeing on the response to that is some people are saying, we got to push toward strongman. And then we have other people that are saying, nope, we've got to push toward saving the republic. Now, I don't think that pushing toward strongman or monarchy makes that an immoral argument. I think what it is just, look, guys, this is the realization of how this works, and it's going to happen, right? And I get it, right? I'm not.
And I would rather have a monarch than a tyrant.
I get, and so
but
that's
the
why
problem is most people just associate those as one and the same.
I know, but that's why I say I'm not denigrating that. What I'm saying is that I believe that America, because of the unique way we've been established, that we never moved through one cycle to another cycle to another cycle. We set up a particular thing to embrace the positives of all those cycles. What I think we need to do is we need more people that recognize it for what it is, recognize how we were established for what it is, and fight for it. But the only thing that will provide you with the courage and the ability to sacrifice in order to achieve it is the religious foundation.
And that's why I think that ultimately the attempts to save the system can't prevail, because here the problem, it's so funny because I have people that get upset at me when I say things like the Constitution is a dead letter. The rule of law means nothing anymore. It's just ruled by men. Men write laws, they enforce laws, and I want my guys to be the ones writing and enforcing the laws. And some people are like, absolutely, give them hell, Christian. And then other people see this and they're like, you're just advocating for tyranny from your side. You just want to enforce your will. And I'm like, yeah, I do want to enforce my will because I think my will is not evil. And I think that the left's morality is an inversion of actual morality. But to that point, there are I think a lot of people that understandably, and I get it, that look at the stuff that I say and they're kind of terrified. They're like, this is just devolving into tyranny. But that's my whole point. I think that I'm actually trying to avoid tyranny.
Yeah.
I do not think that it is possible for us to maintain the system. The counterpoint that I make to the classical liberals, for example, that I'm always loving to hate on my Twitter account.
Just keep it really fast because we're at an hour 20 right now.
Don't worry, this will be the end here. The thing that I'm always hating on from the libertarians or the classical liberals is that I feel like they are trying to preserve a system that has basically lost the spiritual component that allowed it to perpetuate. The systems are still there, the mechanisms are still there, but the animating spirit behind it is gone. And how can you get to a point where you reinvigorate people's belief in a system that they don't believe in anymore? It's not that believe it or not, people say that, like, they get mad at me at times and they're like, you don't believe in the Constitution. No, it's that I believe the Constitution is no longer fit for purpose because the people don't believe in it anymore. Half of our country thinks it's a system of, hierarchical, white, heteronormative, slave-owning men that wrote it, and therefore it's illegitimate. How do you negotiate with those people who don't share a moral or philosophical or religious foundation with you? If we all believed in these things, and we used to at one point, right? When we all believed in these things, the system worked almost perfectly. Not quite perfectly, but almost. As perfect as the Roman system did, if not better. But we don't believe in these things anymore. And so when I say things like the Constitution's a dead letter and the rule of law doesn't matter anymore, it's just ruled by men, it's not because I haven't gone through immense heartbreak and anguish coming to that conclusion. There was a point, and you know this because you know me. There was a point in time where I upheld these things as the most important man-made documents ever written. And in many respects, I still think they are. I just think that they're incapable of functioning anymore when half the population thinks that they're tools of white oppression or patriarchy or whatever it is, right? They just think they're illegitimate. They think they're morally illegitimate. How do you get people to respect a document that they think is morally illegitimate? I don't respect it anymore, not because I think it's morally illegitimate, but because I don't think it can physically operate when half the country thinks it's morally illegitimate. And so the reason I now identify as a post-liberal reactionary is because I'm looking at what will come next, because I want to avoid tyranny at all costs.
So I understand that, right? And I respect the explanation and the way that you gave it. I'm going to respond to it. But first, if you've actually enjoyed this conversation, you would like to participate in it more, please check out our intentional community. You can find the link in the description. If you would like to be more involved, to be able to ask questions as we're talking about this, to be able to do all those things, that is the place to join, communicate, and help make the community better. All right. I'm going to go ahead and sum it up right here with kind of a response to that. Because again, I think Christian's done a very good job of actually giving a very, very respectable argument for this idea that the American system, America, if it's going to be saved, is going to have to go through this process that Polybius lays out. And now it's just a question of recognizing where we are on the stage and making sure that we adopt the next step as best way we can in order to avoid the worst versions. And I can appreciate that. Here's what I'm going to say in response. I think that, again, as we've discussed this, and as we've discussed that the American system was set up as an opportunity to not be encapsulated by one of these forms of government, but rather to recognize the constant nature of human nature, and therefore to set up the positive manifestations of each, I think we did something incredibly important. I think our founders also did something incredibly important with respect to understanding the foundational component that religion, and specifically Christianity for the United States, played as the social fabric for self-regulation and for identifying both truth and fundamental morality. And so the question on how do we save it, for me, is obvious. You have to get back to the foundation. And the foundation, as much as we love the Constitution, as much as we love maybe our system of government, as much as we love free market economics, none of those are the foundation of our republic. The foundation of a republic, whether people want to admit it or not, whether my political allies want to admit it or not, was ultimately rooted in Christianity. Because it's the only thing that actually provided objective truth and objective morality. And we see that because as American society has become more secular, and as American society has become more willing to just simply say, we don't need any of those religious tropes anymore, we can get by fine without it. The question is, have we? Because ultimately, you are going to be ruled by what you believe about God. And if we adopt the Marxist view that there is no God, that essentially we are the best that we can ever hope for, and whatever utopia we can create is the ultimate heaven we will ever experience, well then yes, we are going to move more toward mob rule, the concentration of power, and various entities are going to come in and we're going to see all the worst elements of the cycle vying for power. Why? Because why not? There is no ultimate good. There's just what's ultimately useful in that moment. And who will decide what's useful? Whoever holds power. But if we can get back to this understanding that no, it is rooted in the idea of objective truth and objective morality, and that we're going to embrace that. And we're going to once again defend it boldly and unapologetically. We're going to raise our kids to defend it. Well, then I do believe that we can save this system, because I believe the foundation upon which it was built is true. And the question ultimately on who rules in a society is based off of who is willing to be the strongest, the wisest, and for a noble purpose. Now, the strongest and wisest don't always win. And they lose usually because they're vastly outnumbered. But the one thing I will say that I think is incredibly encouraging about all of this, when I look at the United States and our system, is that we're the ones that want to have kids. We're the ones that want to educate them in the way that they should go. We don't want to rule for power's sake. We don't want to dominate over everybody else and control them, but we do want to foster the sort of society where truth and morality can reign. And we do want to foster the sort of society where you are free to make your own decisions, even ones that we might disagree with, provided that you will accept personal responsibility for those decisions, because it's the only option. It's the only way in which freedom can reign and liberty can reign over licentiousness and moral decadence. And so I believe if we are willing to continue to fight for that and continue to raise a generation to do that, we can do it in one generation. Why? Because the other side of this argument has adopted an inverse moral proposition, which ultimately hates the traditional family, hates having more kids, hates essentially doing all of the things that are fundamentally necessary for the advancement of a thriving society. And the only reason they've been allowed to get this far is because they've attempted to import a population, which, by the way, much of that population they've imported is actually rejecting their ideology as well. And then the other way they get away with it is we allow them to educate our kids. But once again, you're starting to see a pushback on that. You see it with the Supreme Court arguments that are coming now. And you know what? I agree with one thing that KBJ said. Well, if you don't like this system, you can homeschool your kids. Yes, you can. You can start to take ownership and responsibility once again for what you believe and for raising up a generation that also believes it and is willing to fight for it. And I know it's possible because we've had the privilege to do it. Tina and I have had the privilege to do it. And there is nothing more wonderful than watching your kids grow up strong in their faith, strong in the idea of personal responsibility, of objective truth, of objective morality, that believes in the Constitution, that believes in our republic, and are willing to sacrifice and fight to preserve it. That is why I maintain hope, and it is why I honestly believe that if we can get back to this idea of, look, first things first. Yes, be involved in politics. Yes, go out there and do what you need to do economically. Yes, be involved. But all of this fight starts in our homes. And if we fight that battle effectively, I think we win the war. And ultimately, we win the war not by destroying our opponents, who are ultimately other flesh and blood human beings. We win it because we convince them. Because the decadence they have bought into and the lie that they have bought into will not ultimately sustain them. It will leave them depressed and miserable. And at some point, you're going to get a generation that looks at that and says, there is something inherently wrong. I want to look around and I'm tired of being told what to think. I want to look around at who's been successful. What are they doing? And if we're those people, I honestly believe we win. Once again, we hope that you found this discussion, the arguments that we went through, the evidence presented, the history discussed. We hope you found it useful and beneficial. And again, if you want to be a part of that, please consider joining our community. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next episode.